I'm Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. However, to be fair, what we tend to concentrate on, as you may well know if you're a regular listener, is geopolitics. So, that encompasses everything I've said just previously, and the much, much greater aspects of how the world functions and the people that make it function. Politicians, civil servants, actually business people, 9 times out of 10. I say that because Davos is happening right now. And also people who sometimes we don't think about. And this is today's guest. I've got on Dr. Rachel Taylor, who I want her to tell you what she thinks about COVID-19 and in particular the vaccine thereof. Because, we have great trust in the system, and millions, billions of us, including me, have put our hands into the hands of medics and we've said, there you go, inject something into my arm. I don't really know what it is, but I believe you when you tell me it's going to be better. So, what's the truth about that? Rachel, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Carlton. Thank you so much for having me on.
Not a problem. I'm actually going to ask you let's do a quick verification. So for all the people listening out there, and for those who may or may not, after you've said your piece, have some doubts, let me just ask you, what are your sort of credentials as a doctor? What's your
well, I'm a neuroscientist, but I also have qualifications in molecular biology, because I believe if you're doing research that you should be able to do all your research yourself. So most people, if any kind of psychology or neuropsychology research, if they're trying to do anything around the biology, will send off their stuff, their research, their data to a lab and get somebody in a lab to analyze it. But I'm not that kind of person. I might be a control freak, but I like to understand everything that's going on. So I have my credentials basically in anything to do with sort of the brain and nervous system. I have understanding of molecular biology, sort of on a micro basis, sort of DNA, RNA, and human biology, but I think I'm what people describe as a polyglot. Okay. My PhD supervisor used to berate me because he used to say I used to start everything off with philosophy. And I was like, we're talking about human beings. How can you not start with philosophy?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
like, why are we doing this? What is the meaning of life? Yeah. And then we progress from there. So. So my credentials is like every day is a learning curve. Every day is a learning opportunity. I don't consider myself an expert in terms. I think too many experts think that they know everything. But I consider myself a curious. I explore, I discover, I listen, and I try to get as much information as possible. So, that's a really roundabout way of saying I'm a scientist, Carlton, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. In the scientific world, generally, you have peer review. Now, do you believe in peer review?
Well, I'm actually a peer reviewer. So, do I believe? I believe that it's an ideology that should work. The very basis of peer review is that you are getting other professionals within your sphere of expertise to review your work and to say whether it's it's genuine, it's relevant, it's replicable, that kind of thing. But I often feel frustrated when I see sort of the peer reviews going on, because how has this got past peer review? When I do a peer review, I want to see the data. I want to see how they've arrived at their conclusions. I want the raw data. I don't just want their workings out, because how do I know what model they've used? How do I know if they've manipulated the data? So as a purist point of view, I'd love to say that peer review works, but can we be sure that it does? And one thing's for sure, you see an increasing amount of bias that's coming out in journals right now. And I see a lot of my, people that I would consider to be knowledgeable and certainly experts in their field, who are actually trying to sort of talk about their data outside of the peer review system, because no one will actually publish it, because it's not following an official narrative. And I think that's quite upsetting. And for scientists, for me, the beauty of science is it's not the science, it's not dogma. Science is so complex and so, there's so many threads running through it, and, things are proven until they're not, and things are not proven until they are, and when you get a group of professionals, people who are genuinely interested in a room together, you will get lots of opposing opinions until you reach a consensus where magic has happened. And I think, when we talk about the science, we're losing that beauty.
I mean, look, the other side to that coin would be that there is a party line that the system throws out. And the reason why I just say the system, because, depending on where you are, what country you are, it can be more state orientated. In other countries, it may be more business orientated. In other countries, it may be ideologically orientated. But there tends to be a party line which is pushed through. And oftentimes, in my experience, limited experience, what you get pushed forward then via the media is then the perspective that the party, the system, wishes to push. So the scientists may have a perspective, but it's not necessarily the one that gets the publication. I don't mean in journals that are specifically made for scientists or for those with that sort of leaning. I mean the generalized public systems, which is what the vast majority of us read and the vast majority of us see, or the vast majority of us hear. And it frankly doesn't have to be in the scientific world. It can be in any part of the system. My familiarity ends and starts with what the political perspective is, and that political perspective is pushed forward from the beginning by the powers that be. So my question is, how do we know in science that that isn't the perspective that's coming through?
Well, I suppose the quick answer to that is you don't. That's a very quick answer. And I suppose that the longer answer is that, even people who claim not to have a bias will have a bias. And I hate it when people call it an unconscious bias, because, generally it's not an unconscious bias. Absolutely. I hate, that term in itself. It's like absolving yourself of responsibility, isn't it? And I think, anybody has to say that there is a bias, and you look at the influences that's all around. And because the brain and nervous system is my absolute favorite thing, you have to accept that part of our brain, and certainly all the senses, are going to be taking all this information in, and whether you like it or not, you will be being influenced by the messaging. And something that I've been really keen to point out to people is that there's not been enough thinking going on. The prefrontal cortex is not being used enough because the limbic system, our emotional center of the brain, is being bombarded with constant emergencies, constant bad news, constant you're going to kill granny or you're going to kill yourself, and this is going to affect a lot of people. And it does a lot of damage, So I think, what we need to realize is that there is always going to be a bias, and it's how much you want to trust that bias and how much
you can consciously deal against it.
Or
look at it with your own perspective and say, this and this is what I believe from my limited knowledge. So it's what I call the muck of ages going through my. But the other side to that coin is, how do you know that your limited knowledge, your anecdotal knowledge, is correct? I hate extrapolations because it's often done. Well, I'm meant to be some sort of criminologist. I don't really believe in it that much, to be fair. It's just a collection of information from various countries and various thoughts and various ideals and various understandings of that. And then what happened a lot in that field is you then extrapolate out and say, because of this particular cohort, this means X, Y, and Z. And I would often challenge that at the core. And they said, well, that's not for now, that's for a PhD. So what you're telling me is that a chap who's done a bachelor's or a chap who's done a master's is not as good or does not have the same understanding as the woman who's done a PhD.
Yeah.
Because you are orientating them just to regurgitate rather than to think.
Yeah.
So my question is, and this is why I come round to this field, if we don't have some systems in place, though, that sort of funnel that I've just explained going through to where you are now, PhD, to your doctorate, if we don't have that funnel, how do we know that people are educated? Or do we need to?
Well, I think, that's a really interesting question. And in terms of education, let's break that word down. Education is being led, educally. I did Latin A level, amongst my many sims. Not only do I enjoy philosophy, actually partake in ancient languages. I'm fascinated by rhetoric. I'm fascinated by narrative. And education itself is not, and especially in this day and age, and I can say that as I have a PGCE as well, and I am a mother whose children, I've got an older child who's gone through that system and two younger children, and I can say that education is not really teaching people to critically think. You do not need a PhD to be able to look at something and think, right, well, this is one version of events. Let me try and see what somebody else's opinion is. Let me see what somebody else's opinion is, and let me form my own opinion based on the information that I've gathered. I mean, basically that's what a PhD is. It's like doing research and formulating a hypothesis or formulating sort of an inquiry because of what data you have gathered. Now, people do that in everyday life, but what I'm sort of worried about and what really scares me is that people are being told that they're incapable of doing that. You don't need a PhD to be a critical thinker.
Absolutely.
You just need to think.
Absolutely. You'll notice that I have a critical thinking episode every so often where I try and turn things upside down because I was in an industry that is well versed at pushing a particular perspective, as of course does the media. So that's one of the problems. Now that's a beautiful segue actually, which you do, into what I wanted to talk to you about initially. And already I know, if you are willing, I will have you back. But because this is fascinating. But what I wanted to talk to in particular was your thoughts on the COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah. Oh,
start me off.
Yeah, where do I start? I think I started, and this is such a shame because whenever anybody's asked their opinion on sort of the COVID-19 vaccine, it's like everybody has to justify and say whether they're pro-vax or anti-vax, and it's just like people shouldn't have to do that because in essence, it's gene therapy. Certainly Pfizer and the Moderna offerings that we're having in this country, that gene therapy, And people who are eminently more qualified than me in immunology, are speaking out and saying, this is not a traditional vaccine. This is gene therapy that we don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. And I think it's really interesting that it was literally just before Christmas, Pfizer announced that they were starting long-term studies on the long-term effects of the COVID-19 vaccine. So I think we need to be, really sort of, we have to be cautious, and we have to be understanding that we didn't have all the facts. Now, I know I was watching a podcast video just yesterday morning where, people were arguing over in America saying, well, we had 9 months of data. Well, traditionally, vaccine trials last up to 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's all very well saying that we have 9 months of data. We know from sort of the Pfizer files that have been released that data was very much cherry picked. And in this country, speaking of the UK, when the vaccine was actually introduced, that it was going to be offered, it was going to be offered to the over 50s and those who were more clinically vulnerable of being really poor, really poorly through COVID. And, and we have to sort of say now that, there is so much data out there about COVID in its various iterations. And how they knew which groups were more affected, they know which groups were going to get more poorly. There was certainly lots of people who it literally, was like a cold, and for other people it was something more serious. But what they knew from the beginning with the data from these very short trials was that there were adverse effects. And when you look
let me hold you there a second.
Yeah.
No, perfect. I just want to hold you there because I need to introduce the political aspect.
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely and totally right. But let's introduce the political aspect to it. So you had the Johnson government, which basically had not believed in the vaccination process at all to start off with.
Yeah.
And what it was going down the road of was herd immunity.
Yeah.
When they realised that herd immunity would be catastrophic in their eyes, I don't know the data, so I can only say what they believe to be the case. And I think that is right. Then, of course, they turned track. And because Johnson is what he is, he's a chap who said, let's be first to break through this circumstance. Now, none of these vaccines were actually British vaccines. Even the Oxford, as they used to put it, is basically just a version with German input onto it, as you know.
Yeah.
So these were collective vaccines with collective belief that people have put together. But what Johnson wanted to do was nationalise that process and say, we're getting our Oxford vaccine out because we can do this because we're no longer in the European Union. Yeah. So he was putting a political perspective forward. And basically what he did is he didn't test. He didn't say, let's test the vaccine thoroughly to its 8th degree. We know we can't do it to its 8th degree within 9 months, but whereas even the United States, in a land with a guy who did not believe in much, and science definitely not, at least he was saying that we should actually test longer, and the FAA did that. And obviously in the European Union, they tested longer, which is why we got the vaccine out first. It wasn't it was more of a badge of courage rather than a badge of sensibility and fortitude. In terms of, we just threw it out.
Would you consider it a badge of courage? I think a badge of bravado, maybe.
Well, yeah. The reason why, very true. You're absolutely right. The reason why I use courage, because of course the courage wasn't to him, was it? The courage was the British public that he was using it on. Yeah. But he got from that the reflected sunlight. To say this is what we can do when we're alone, when we rule our own country, etc., etc. Now, as we know, if you follow the European Union, he could have always done that. He didn't need to, even if he was still in the European Union, they could have gone against the sentiment and Because that was one of the things that was emulgated, if you will, towards the state rather than the collective. They decided as a collective subsequently, but the state could have always done that for itself. Any of the 27, 28 in the past could have done that. Now, the interesting thing was that it seemed to pay off. Now, maybe it paid off because, and this is again the political aspect which I want to put, and then I'd ask you to come back on it, and why it was probably important that he did put something out there and the state did put something, is because we had decided very early on, and I don't know if you recall it, there was Cummings basically said we had a what they call a whiteboard process, and they had on that process, who do we allow to die? Yeah. Right? Now, that was said once or twice, never came out again. Now, that's exactly what they did. I should put myself forward. I used to run a thing called the Strategic Analysis Unit of the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. So what I used to do was, in fact, I formed the organisation. What we did is we'd look at things 3 to 5 years, and we'd say what will be a problem for the United Kingdom in the future. And in doing that, we looked at all of these type processes, from obviously the obvious things of rioting, communism, animal liberation, extreme right wing, how it would affect the UK and police and the intelligence and security services and potentially military, to things that were off the other side of that. At the time we had mad cow disease, would happen with some type of pandemic. I was set on that course by government, say, look at that for us, and then something else happened and they pushed us on to something else. Yeah. So, but the point was that is looked at, and it's looked at how it affects the state. So I knew exactly what he was doing when he says, who do we allow to die? Now, if you notice, after those meetings, they basically started bringing old people out of hospitals and putting them back into old people's homes. I'll suggest to you that the decision was old people may die. Because what happened is the systems in northern Italy, very good healthcare system in the north, northern Italy were being overrun, and in Spain and in other places, were being overrun by elderly people taking up beds and dying. So what they perceived was, let's get rid of the elderly, right? Let them die because they've had their time. Let them die, and allegedly, I have to say, allegedly they perceive that. And so therefore our hospitals, the NHS, won't be overrun, which, by the way, has some of the lowest emergency beds in Europe. So they knew they'd be overrun quicker than anybody else. Now, they did this little thing about saying, oh, we've opened these Nightingale hospitals. The reason why we have few beds is not because we don't have technology in the beds, it's because we don't have the people. Yeah. Right, so you can open all the Nightingale hospitals you want, and the Chinese superbly, built a hospital in a day or 2 days, but they had the people. Yeah. Because their military is full of people who are medicals, really skilled, etc., etc. We didn't have the people, so they had to do something, and I'm guessing they just said, "Okay, let the elderly die." Now, with that being the focus, was it not, from their perspective, right? That what you had to do was try and create something that prevented the sickness at the level where you were required to take up these emergency beds? That's my question to you.
Well, you see, the thing is, listening to everything that you were saying, and I'm completely, aware of, these strategic meetings myself, but we already supposedly had a pandemic plan that they didn't follow. Which had been ratified. What was it? Not even 12 months before the actual pandemic. So they didn't follow that plan at all, even though they had modelled it, even though they had tried it out.
But I understand the plan was for influenza.
And at the point of sort of the beginning of the pandemic, they didn't know how different that, or they said, allegedly, they didn't know how different this new the virus was. But also, it really, it's not logical to me. And this is something that I really struggled with throughout the whole of the policies and the pandemic, because the policy decisions weren't logical. So in terms of who deserves to die, who we're prepared to get rid of, who is it okay dying? The policies themselves, they were obviously only looking at short-term impact on deaths and not looking at the sort of the longitudinal model of how the policies themselves are going to pan out. Now, to me, right from the beginning. And I was very aware of what was happening because my partner had, in the January of 2020, gone to live in New Zealand for a while. So, and I was meant to be going out to visit him in April. So I was very aware, probably more so than other people, because I'd booked a flight. I was like, oh no, my flight keeps on getting cancelled. So it was a very trying time, it's very, how selfish of me to say that. But I was aware of this probably before many people were. It was like these policies were not making sense to me. It was like, we know if we do this, and this is going to have serious repercussions for quite a lot of the public demographic, not just for the next 12 months, but in years to come. It didn't really make much sense to me. And, I also knew that, quite rightly, as you said, that we were struggling for hospital beds. I think, we had 130,000 less than we had sort of 5 years previously, and that this was going to have a severe impact on, our ability to deal with any kind of medical emergency. So that meant that, the policies for me were not proportionate in terms of what the public health issue would be. It was proportionate in what are our resources from, we sort of deified the NHS, didn't we?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And it was like, how come, that rhetoric all the time, save the NHS? Well, the NHS didn't need saving. It's, the UK population, I'm talking about that because, obviously that's the country we're living in, but, the wider world, the global population, but particularly we needed to save the UK population. And it wasn't just from COVID, it was the impact of every bit of narrative. And something that was really interesting to me was that very quickly there was a lot of propaganda, and I'm going to call it that because it was a lot of propaganda around how people should be treating other people, how people should be living, how people should be behaving. And I was like, if they didn't know this was coming, then how, and we're not meant to see people, we're meant to be very careful about who we're seeing. How have they managed to record all of these in a very short space of time? So it all felt a little bit off kilter to me. And, I think, we were talking about the politicization of public health, and like you said, the whiteboard exercise and modeling in general, is that what we know from previous outbreaks, viral outbreaks, is that the modeling has never been right. And I know that there's a proviso that, you have to adhere to it, because what if it does turn out right and the government's made the wrong decision? But I think that there is a certain amount of brevity around that. And, because we're not privy to all of the minutes from the meetings, we're not privy to all of the information because it's deemed not to be in the public interest. We will never know if there were people in that room who were actually, we started off this episode talking about, sort of the oppositional approach, that you have one side and then you have someone talking at the other side, and then, with the intent that you meet somewhere in the middle where everyone's not getting what they want, but we're getting something that actually is taking into consideration all the demographics, all the population and what they need. Does that make sense?
It does, but I don't think that's how the system works.
No, it doesn't.
The British political system works.
It doesn't, you're right.
First and foremost, the British political system is an expedient system. So it's all about short-termism. And that, unfortunately, runs into our economics as well, short-termism, because it's so much run by the city. And the city is basically an onshore area. So it's money speaks, because it's a massive part of our GDP, and more importantly, it is where in the end the politicians will make their money, right? Yeah. So you've got to look at that. So expediency is one of our primary elements in the United Kingdom. Secondly, you spoke about how it seemed to be that things were in place. Well, they would be, because, as I said to you, this was back in 2002 when I ran the NPOIU's SAU. And already we, as I said, I was tasked with looking at pandemic. I think there was, as I said, there was the mad cow disease and there was a bird flu incident at the time. Yeah. So I was tasked with that. But with this expediency that we talk about, something else came and said, oh, drop that, look at this. So already we were thinking about how you would deal with issues, and stuff was put in place, basic stuff to be fair. And throughout the years, they've done more and more and more on those issues. So there would have been things put in place for that. Now, the one bit that I am a little bit more sanguine about is that there clearly is a problem. Because if this was just, the United Kingdom having the problem, I'd say fair enough, maybe somebody's playing around. But it's not, it's the whole world. And it's all of the world, even areas where they're not particularly friends. And that was the other reason why I was going to say, actually, when you talked about looking at how we can move drugs forward, I just want to put this to you. Because it was a worldwide situation, normally, and the UK is one that is really, really sensitized to this problem, many of the UK scientists are in the military field because that's where we show our capacity.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what it's done is it's sort of, if you will, skew-whiffed our manufacturing possibilities to that area. So instead of building white goods, etc., creating them, or cars or whatever it might be, do you know the United Kingdom does not produce one single mass-produced vehicle?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Crazy, isn't it?
They're all owned by foreign companies. Right?
Yeah.
So because we skew that, and we say, oh well, a foreigner can own this. We talk about British, what do we call them? British brands, they say.
Yeah.
British brand. Well, it's not a brand, is it? Exactly. A Rolls Royce is basically BMW. Not basically, it is. It's run by BMW. Right? Daimler is run by Mercedes. So it's not as though these are British products. They're not. And the decisions are made abroad. And the point why I bring that up is those are long-term decisions made by a German government, or the PSA group, by a French government, or an American government, or a Japanese government, all the cars that we produce here, for how those cars will function. But they're long term, they're not short term.
Yeah.
Our problem is that we've gone down a short term route. Now we do long term on one thing only that I can think about, and that's the military.
Yeah.
So the difference is, I think, though, that when COVID-19 came through, some of those military people who were generally squirreling away doing stuff important down, whatever they're doing, actually then were co-opted into looking at how we could aid this. But that was from around the world. So same for the United States, out in Fort Bragg, doing what all the scientists are doing. Everybody was coming together. Indeed, later on, we found out from Dr. Fauci, didn't we, in the United States, that actually Wuhan was doing the experimentation on COVID-19 on behalf of the United States.
Yeah.
so on behalf of the United States. So you've got your president calling it the China disease, but the China disease is a United States disease created in China.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Because they couldn't do they weren't allowed to do the experimentation they wished to do in the United States. So they did it in China.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the interesting thing. So it's a worldwide collective. So what I'm saying is it's gone wrong. The world knew it had gone wrong. So collectively they worked with the world. So maybe it cut down that period of time you require. I know we can't look at how the long-term effects are, but maybe in bringing it in the first place, it cut down the time that was necessary to bring out the antidote, i.e. vaccine.
Yeah.
Does that sound right to you?
Well, even if you say that now, everything that you've just said, even though we have all the data, we have the facts, there'll be a vast majority of people who have been conditioned into saying that's a conspiracy theory,
Yes,
and still would not want to believe that's actually true. And but then in the next breath we'll be saying, well, the vaccine must be safe then, because they know how this virus is working. Now the thing is, though, with sort of viruses, and anybody who knows anything about sort of that molecular world know that viruses are sort of the most resilient, the most the best kind of vectors going for anything, because they really do want to proliferate and change, and they will mutate and they will change. And, and this is something that you cannot always factor in, how something is going to, vary, how something is going to mutate. And, there's something, and call it the cynic in me, is that, if they, they had, created this version of COVID in the lab, and they got out, that it's going to be an ever perpetual gravy train for those people who claim to be able to produce a vaccine for it. Because
that's true. We can't take the business aspect out of it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I think that's.
Sorry, I broke you.
No, it's fine, because I think, I think the very fact that public health, you quite rightly point out, it has been politicized, and the reason it's been politicized is because people can make money from it. And I was speaking to someone just this very morning about how it's become so normalized for people to be unwell in the Western world. It's almost like, you're not normal unless there's something wrong with you, and I battle all the time, like, most of the time there's actually nothing wrong with you. There's something extremely wrong with the environment, and your body and your brain are just reacting to that. It's the environment that's wrong. There's nothing actually wrong with you. So, you quite rightly point out, it's like the politicization of it. And, you have mentioned sort of the next career step for most politicians is then going to work for these big organizations who have been lobbying them throughout their political career.
Absolutely.
And this is what's wrong with all of this. And for people who genuinely are in the science because they love science, because they love discovery, because they love exploration, and they're not in it but they haven't got a price. They just genuinely are interested in sort of, making things better for humanity. It's very difficult to be part of a landscape where you can see other scientists, other people who claim to work in science, who are quite obviously being bought off by these big organizations who are making a lot of money from pharmaceutical products. And I think there's something around how harmful and disrespectful it is when you are trying to be discredited, trying to be called out, because you genuinely want the best for humanity, and you want to point out that a pharmaceutical product isn't for everybody.
So my question is, what would you have done to stem the movement of the vaccine? Was it the right thing to put it in people's arms in the billions, or I don't want to just make two left or right. I don't want to say herd immunity against vaccine. But what I want to say is, what was the right move? I mean, nobody undermines their economy to the levels that we did. And of course, up to very recently, the Chinese were still doing it, probably correctly. They've only moved to open up because they couldn't withstand the bandwidth of the West. And of course, looking at, from my perspective, the agitation would have been one that various interesting countries would have liked to keep making within China. So, look, the reality is they basically had to give way in the end. And the resultant is, you can see that many more people have now caught disease, which they had under control to some extent, using a potentially less pharmaceutical way of doing it. Although people will say that their vaccine wasn't as good, etc., but maybe their vaccine was based on the fact that they didn't want to put into people's arms something that they didn't know what would be the resultant in 10 years' time. I don't know. I'm not skillful enough to understand that. But what I do know is that as a person in the field I was in, that there will be bodies, particularly in, let's say, the number one country in the world, that fears the Chinese becoming the number one country in the world, that then was a time to agitate the Chinese public towards actions against their government. So once that happened, the government had a decision. Do we have rioting on our streets, or do we open it up, even though we know the best thing for China is to keep it closed?
I mean, you started asking sort of the question, what would I suggest? Well, I think one of the fundamental things that I do in any kind of work that I do with people with that research or actually direct sort of behavioural change work is that I ask for informed consent. And informed consent is that to the best of your knowledge, you give all the information about how what you are doing can impact that individual. You know, that's when you apply for ethics for research. You have to literally go through everything. How can this impact someone? What are the dangers here? What are the risks? And to my knowledge, and speaking sort of, you know, anecdotally to people who have been vaccinated, they weren't, there was no opportunity for informed consent. You know, they had to literally sign something, but if they asked questions about it, you know, they weren't given satisfactory answers.
I think the answer to that is that the people providing them with the jab didn't know themselves.
But so then it's not informed consent, is it? So for me, it's that as a human being, as an individual, and I know we were sort of battered with the greater good, which is one of my pet hates, you know, the greater good. You know, it might have worked in ancient Greece when there was 100,000 people in a city, but you can't, you know, you talk about extrapolation, you can't extrapolate that outwards because the individual would never matter. And that's not a really good way for anybody to live, thinking that they have no value and they're worthless, you know. So we have to be really careful on this. And I think for me is that if you give people all the information, if you give people, you know, this cost benefit analysis, and they knew right from the beginning, they knew it didn't stop transmission, it didn't stop you catching it. And what it did at best was stop hospitalization for those who are at most risk of COVID. Now, that's really important, that information. I remember the vitriol against those who didn't want to be vaccinated, and the sheer nastiness and the cruelty exhibited towards them from so-called celebrities, and you know, how they were called stupid and how they were called granny killers. Now, that's not the signs of a well-informed society. That's bullying. That's coercion. You know,
society isn't well informed, is it? About anything. But our society is not well informed about anything. So that's what I find from this program. Our society is not well informed about actually most things.
So how can we sit and think that we are superior to the Chinese?
Because that's what you're told.
Exactly, but you know, it goes down. There's many different forms of propaganda. You know,
absolutely. You know, what we call psychological operations.
Yes,
these days, not propaganda. But you see, no, look. The reality of the situation is that the United Kingdom has a population that is generally apathetic.
Yes.
Okay, so top of my head. Let's take Scotland, right? So Scotland says it wants to be independent, right? So the vitriol is that why should Scotland be independent? Or F them then, and I've heard this said many times, let them go, right? Two ways but when you look at it from the Scottish perspective, the union is an unequal union. They came in under the Active Union in 1770 or 17. Yeah. They came in an active union. They agreed it. You know, they were bankrupt. It wasn't as though that's why they've kept all the different laws, etc., and all the different ways of doing things and all. And they basically would share the same king and queen from there on. So if that's an active union, surely that you can leave that union as you wish. It isn't that, well, you've had a vote now and you can't have another vote for the next 20 years. Taking into account the reason that swung that vote, primarily for Scottish people who are outward bound as a general rule, those who were educated, now there's many that weren't, but those who were, is that if they left at that time, they wouldn't have got back into the European Union without a battle. For the simple reason the European Union, this is the politics of it again, had to think about, well, what will happen in the various regions of other countries. I'm talking powerful countries now. So like Bavaria. Would Bavaria want to move away from Germany? Would, obviously in Spain, you've got the obvious perspective there, what would happen. Then you're talking about France and its obvious parts of that may wish to secede from the Union. And in Belgium, you've got obviously obvious points of the Walloons and the Flanders. So again, they were thinking for themselves, if we allow Scotland in, because it's just broken from the Union of the United Kingdom, then that's not good. So we wouldn't do it. So therefore, the Scottish perspective, the Scottish position on independence had to be without, at least for several years, the European Union.
This question we will answer next week. So we'll see you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.